actually a rhetorical question. Anyway, let me say good morning, and let me welcome everybody to the second day of our workshop. We got off to a really good start yesterday, and yesterday we kind of looked at a range of issues that affect urban transportation everywhere, but we looked at it from a local perspective, a New York perspective, although we New Yorkers don't think of ourselves as local, but nonetheless, nonetheless, I'm sure the rest of you, I hope you learned something from it. Today what we're going to do, we're going to take this to the next step, and we're going to go into more detail on the topics that are of mutual interest to all of us. And once again, the purpose of this workshop, unlike the past one, is not so much to have everyone present their research as much as it is to have everyone begin to talk about what are the larger themes and how do these themes begin to connect and overlap. So our first panel today deals with one of my favorite questions: how to best design and implement better access to cities. Andreas Pizzaro is going to be moderating it, and I'll let him take over and introduce the speakers and run the session. But I just wanted to welcome everyone and say we're really looking forward to a really energetic and good day today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elliot. Thank you very much, the organization, and inviting me to this very interesting and prestigious event. My name's Andres Pizzaro, as Elliot said. I have just founded a think tank in Argentina where we want to concentrate on policy, research in urban transport and transport in general. Previously to that, I was lead transportation specialist in the World Bank for 8 years. I worked in the Latin America region and the South Asia region. And before that, I was a consultant in a French consulting firm where I worked in all of the continents. My main focus is urban transport, although I've worked in all areas. And recently I was asked by the UN Economic Commission for Latin America to review, first of all, the urban transport policies applied in Latin American cities, and to produce a new framework. They're particularly interested in a change of paradigm of the way things are done, to produce a framework that could serve as something applicable in several cities in Latin America. And at present, I'm working with the Colombia government to also review the national urban transport policy and produce a change given the difficulties they're experiencing today in the national urban transport sector. So that's me, and what I'd suggest for our panelists is that each of you present yourselves, give us an idea of what your recent work or research is, and before we kick off with the sections.
Thank you, Andres. My name is Juan Carlos Muñoz. I lead the Bus Rapid Transit Center of Excellence in Santiago de Chile, and I am currently an advisor for the government on public transport issues, and I am a member of the board in Metro in Santiago. So my main orientation in my academic career has been run around public transport operations and design, and I'm very pleased to be here.
My name is Aimée Gauthier. I'm with the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. I'm the Chief Program Officer there. I've been working there for about 12 years, and most of my work began in Africa, so I have a lot of experience working in Ghana, Senegal, South Africa, Tanzania. But since then, I've been working with our field offices in the different countries, and we focus mainly on transit and non-motorized transport, and now we're moving into urban development with a focus on BRT.
Good morning, I'm Robert Cervero. I'm a professor of city regional planning at University of California, Berkeley. My focus has long been on transport and land use integration, coordination, sustainable transport systems, so my research is essentially in those areas. I'm currently on sabbatical leave at the University of Cambridge, so I am not driving. I'm walking and biking anywhere, thoroughly enjoying that. So I do a fair amount of work in the field. I'm currently working at a World Bank project in Tanzania on urbanization review strategy, and I do have a Volvo research grant currently. We're looking at BRT, paratransit and formal transit integration, and doing some other things in those kind of arenas, so very happy to be here.
I'm Herrie Schalekamp. I'm a research officer at the University of Cape Town, part of ASCET, the African Centre of Excellence in Transport. I'm also in the field of paratransit, looking at reform of informal public transport systems, particularly the public transport part of our centre. And it's really interesting being here with all these people who have much more experience than I do in the areas I work in. And thank you for having me here.
Great. As you can see in our panel, there's a certain bias for international experience, which is a welcome change from yesterday. So I think we can talk about all of your experience, even if it's not in the international area. But what I'd like to do is start with a few questions and then expand on your personal experience. And one of the things is that this panel is about the design and implementation of access. And as transportation practitioners, our introduction into the field is through transport policies, transportation systems design, and implementation. So my first question is, given that in not only in developing countries, but in many parts of the world, we find cities that are highly segregated socioeconomically. In Latin America, it's very, very a strong feature, and in Chile and South Africa, I think, is one of the important traits of the urban development. Is how do we, or have you been able to come across from the transport side designs or policy designs that have addressed in some way this issue of city segregation? And have you seen that from the policymakers' side, there's any interest in orienting the policy in this manner?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is a very worrying problem. In my city, for instance, and I think that it's common in other cities, at least in Latin America, we have a very segregated, not only a very unequal society, but also very segregated. Like wealthy people will live with wealthy people will live only in poor neighborhoods. And that's one part of the problem, which makes trips unnecessarily long, for instance. But on the other hand, what is happening is that the wealthier people, once the city starts growing and growing, tend to attract downtown activities towards them. So it's not just that the city is uneven. It's also that the center of gravity is moving towards the wealthier neighborhoods. So what this means is that in some way the richest part of the city are taking the downtown to their living room in some way, requesting the rest of the city to make longer and longer trips, not only because the city is bigger, but also because the downtown is moving farther away from them. And that also makes a lot of problems for the public transport system, which is much more compact because now the trips are longer, right? And much more costly because you need to finance a system that needs to move people for longer distances. And I think I don't see a very strong answer to this problem other than really having what in many Latin American cities we lack, which is a metropolitan authority. A transport authority that could in some way take the decisions that are better for the whole city, because the wealthy neighborhoods are building and building and building more office buildings because they know that the people living there will be very happy to move their offices there. So it's a great business if you think locally. I mean, you get the taxes for the city, for the local neighborhood, right? But at the cost of everybody else in the city. And I think this is a very relevant problem, in which the only way we could tackle it efficiently is through having a metropolitan authority, as the main and more efficient cities in the world do. So that would be my contribution in this question.
I think just to build off of what Juan Carlos was saying, in Johannesburg, that's definitely the case. Like Sandton is now the economic center of the city, and the downtown was vacated. And a lot of that was around security concerns. So I think safety factors into how we think about this. But I think it's also like looking at the growth of cities generally. Like in China, cities are just developing new kind of downtowns to their cities because they're growing so fast. In India, the way the growth is happening, the reason why there is this segregation is, for example, there are these tech cities developing outside of cities that supply clean water and electricity and are reliable, and the city governments aren't as reliable. So the private sector is stepping in to make these cities, make these enclaves happen. So I mean, I think there's an issue of security and safety and making people feel, and also reliability and trust in the government. I think that's a big issue. The final thing about economic segregation, which is happening, it's being spurred by policies that aren't necessarily related to transport but have huge transport impacts. And so like if you look at affordable housing policies, a lot of times what they do is they are encouraging economic segregation and isolation further and further away from the city because it's a mix of market and government policies coming together in kind of the worst way. So you have these cities like in Brazil, it's a 2-hour commute to even get to an downtown or economic commercial core. And these are the policies that are being promulgated by housing policy. So I think housing policy also factors into this.
I'm going to really focus more on the planning of how to advance accessibility, certainly the developing world, but as well as the developed world. And we had some conversation on this yesterday, but if we look in developing countries, you mentioned we have segregation of populations from opportunities for employment, education, medical services, or whatever. When we evaluate transportation proposals, we still largely use traditional mobility-based analysis. We're evaluating travel speeds, travel time savings, and that ends up in all the benefits cost calculus that all investment decisions ultimately ride on. I mean, this is international aid agencies, MPOs, and metropolitan planning organizations. We still largely have metrics which evaluate options, proposals, largely on efficiencies of movements and so forth. And we talk a lot about access, but it's very rhetorical. We don't really have institutionalized metrics to really elevate that as a factor to weigh in whether we're going to invest in this BRT system or if we're going to pursue a certain land use strategy. So I guess, I would sort of approach this a little more systemically. I think we really need to turn our planning processes on their head and really elevate accessibility as a metric to really weigh in on investment decisions, international loans, and these things. The World Bank, ADB, all of these entities, for the most part, still largely look at travel time savings, operating cost savings, safety. That's what hundreds of millions of dollars of investments are riding on. And accessibility is sort of an afterthought. It's sort of the appendix that we sort of raise that. So, we need metrics. So, and it's very complex in the developing world. We heard this yesterday. There might be a lot of poor folks that happen to be around tons of jobs, but they don't qualify for them, or they're part of the informal economy, so their employment opportunities are quite scattered. There might be disabled folks in wheelchairs in poor countries of the world that simply can't access buses or get across curb cuts. So we need really multiple metrics of access at a very fine-grained streetscape level, at a corridor level, at a regional level, to go beyond this sort of conceptualization of access to be really an overarching metric that we use to make very tough prioritization decisions and investment choices. So that would be my sort of first take. And I would just add, this is a session about implementation tools. There's a lot of things we can do to reward investments in infrastructure or land use decisions that bring activities together, that create more opportunities, be it mixed-use zoning or inclusionary zoning or efficiency location ideas when we make investment decisions, or banks are lending for projects. So I think we know all of the things that will in some way incentivize location choices or investment decisions that will enhance accessibility. It always comes down to, again, institutional inertia, just the lack of political will, all the obstructions we're all familiar with in this room to really go beyond that concept to actual implementation. So, but I think like a lot of areas, this is an arena which is sort of embryonic still. We need to test the waters. We need to do a lot more pilot projects. We need to really do some demo projects of accessibility-based planning and investment to see what the outcomes are. I mean, ultimately, we don't want to just be able to measure how many hospital beds you can get to within 30 minutes or how many schools young kids can get to on an informal transit network within 20 minutes, within a certain fare. We want to really look at outcomes. We want to look at effects on educational performance or employment or some kind of useful public engagement. So we just need a whole set of tools that allow us to better evaluate and implement the projects.
It's interesting sitting here on stage. I was thinking about what I was going to say today, planning a whole speech. And it doesn't really work that way. And what it came down to is I thought, what are we doing? What are we actually doing here? There are lots of very important people here in very important positions, working for very important agencies. And we tend to just assume that we're all doing the right thing. And I think more often than not, we forget what we're doing. We are trying to help millions of individuals improve their lives by increasing their access to different opportunities. And that's a really big task. So, it's like saying we want to resolve or eradicate poverty. I don't think we can do that on behalf of the, 7 billion people on Earth. So, what I would tend to do is to try and narrow the focus to what my actual sphere of influence is and what each of us can do. A lot of emphasis is on comparability or trying to collaborate to find solutions, new solutions to old problems. And that's really difficult. And I think each of us need to try and put ourselves in the position of the people we're trying to help. Whether we're talking about the urban poor in Africa, which again is an aggregate term, it's to try and disaggregate what we're doing if we are to improve access. And we tend to forget that each of these individuals that we're trying to help, actually, they have a fair amount of control over what's happening in their life. But perhaps the most important is they probably have the best conception of what they need. And our role as academics, professionals, is to try and capture an aggregate of those needs in some kind of policy, some kind of plan. South Africa has a fascinating history. It's a wonderful place to work. Last night we had a conversation over dinner, and again I reminded myself that the country is only 20 years old this year. We had our 20th anniversary of the change to democracy, so-called democracy, in 1994. And that's quite a momentous moment. Well, almost tautological to say that. But there's a lot of opportunity there. But there's also a lot of history. And there are lots of individuals who've had a really tough time out of it, across the board. It's a difficult history to emerge from. But it's not unique to South Africa. As Juan Carlos said, segregation is common. It's almost as if it is part of the human condition. Economic disparities, all these words, these concepts we deal with, they are relatively universal, even in a city like this, which is, it's awe-inspiring coming here from Cape Town. We feel like we're living in a small town there. And despite having the big mountain, it's a small place. But we do have these shared concerns. But always in what we try to do, I think we must go back to that individual perspective of what we're actually doing and the huge responsibility we bear to try and help people in these situations. So now we come to the question of how do we improve access. Again, I'd like to refer to the case of South Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa at least. We see a lot of the international agencies working there. And there's a a debate on whether this involvement of foreign agencies doesn't create dependency. Now, within South Africa, in the last 7 or so years, we've seen a major policy change, perhaps spurred in part by the World Cup, the Soccer World Cup coming there in 2010, trying to improve, as a first step, road-based public transport in the main urban centers of the country. All funded from within. A massive national investment in infrastructure for some BRT services, upgraded bus services, and looking what could be done with minibus taxis, with our form of paratransit there. And even within that, it's very difficult from a national government to try and look at the perspective of the individual. It's a country of 52 million now. Every year you can add 1 to the million count. And it's an enormous challenge, and we've seen very big problems unfold, even with a national government that's supposed to understand its populace relatively well. So there's no definitive answer, and if any of us had those ambitions, I'm afraid to say, rethink that. But I would then just like to end off with that phrase, or with what I started out with, and that is, who are you working for? Who are we working for? And what are their real needs? And always reflect back on it. Not just in the final report we write, but from the very outset.
Thank you very much. I think your responses should be humbling to us, because we're always talking about the transport land use interaction, and one of the greatest problems is the segregation of cities, independent of where the pockets of poverty are. And what we're finding here is that it's very difficult from the introduction through transport policy to actually affect this segregation issue. Now, one of the other, let's say, general problems we've had in developing countries is that from the end of the 1970s, the 80s, with the neoliberal paradigm, there has been a proliferation of informal services through deregulation, and I think this is also a case that is common to many of the cities of the developing world, and it's a context in which practicing urban transport policies is much more complicated than the developed world. So I wanted to start with you and work our way here to hear the Santiago experience. The last is how in South Africa, and in your experience, you've dealt with this more complicated context, which is both political, social, because of the informal services, people that live with them around it, and how you've designed policies in this context.
This is again a big question. Perhaps then to start off with just a bit of context in South Africa. In all the cities and in rural areas in the country, the dominant mode of getting around across longer distances is minibuses, is paratransit. And I think in the last year, Cape Town has now also joined this. We used to have the rail system dominate, but minibuses, even within our city now, are the dominant mode of public transport. Given Cape Town is always a bit different, it's the oldest city, it has very different dynamics. But we have large populations reliant on these small 16, 13-seater vans. And generally, they are villainized, and sometimes for good reason, sometimes less so. But with the country being young, in universal terms, there's a lot of susceptibility to ideas, to concepts that are going around the world. And it seems to me that the decision makers, the national, provincial, municipal decision makers, tend to think that modernization means paratransit is bad, that we must formalize. And just the pure fact that now in the 21st century we've still not formalized must say at least something. So this national policy program that we had essentially said we want to move all our informal operators to being formal operators, to corporatize them, cross what the initial aim was 18 urban areas in the country, which is a huge thing to do. And they will become vehicle operators in these new formal systems. Two cities have made big progress, and there's a lot that we can learn from what's happened. It's very complex. It's very easy to say we want to move from informality to formality, but actually to do that is a huge task. But what has come out in that process is actually that some of these operators have a natural inclination to want to do that. My research over the last 6 years has been to try and understand these reasons, to interview operators, to actually get to hear what they have to say. And the first thing they say is, we have no idea what this policy is. We've never been asked about it. It, just by pure chance, overlaps with some of the larger informal operators who actually do want companies, who do want to be seen to be modernizing, who do like to run big buses as opposed to small minibuses, who want to get away from the history of violence. And that history of violence we see in a lot of cities. Many of these informal systems have that history. So again, it comes down to understanding what the individual perspective is. We can say informality is bad, informality is good, but we do need to understand what the motivations are of individuals. It's very difficult to do, but that's the only way in which we can come to an answer on this formal question.
I long have been a fan of informal services in the developing world. I wish more American cities could have sort of the diversity, variety of motorcycle taxis and three-wheelers and microbuses and minibuses, every kind of carrying capacity, geographic coverage, sort of service price point you can find. It's very rich. And as we become more of a heterogeneous, plural society, we need more choice and variety. So I think it's very good. I mean, in most of America, you have a choice of a very expensive, exclusive ride taxi or a fixed route, fixed schedule bus that comes by every 30 minutes or drive, and most people drive. So there's a lot we could gain by embracing some of the aspects of informality. I mean, the problem obviously is sort of the collectively damaging behavior of unregulated over competition, but the problems are systemic. I mean, these are largely young, low-skilled, unemployable guys from the countryside just coming to cities. Understandably, it's places of opportunity. So you have an oversupply, and so you don't sort of eliminate them. You have to in some way provide other options, gainful employment or education choices, or as happening with some BRT investments, they're actually training and giving microloans to allow them to become bus operators or shareholders or in some way connected to the more formal operations. So there's a lot that needs to be done in that regards. But I think for the most part, as it relates to kind of access, informal carriers have long been superior. I mean, they go into informal neighborhoods that standard buses can't. They can't penetrate these narrow roads, or the roads are washed out. You, in many ways, though, can't divorce, when it comes to the informal sector, access from the affordability question. One of the concerns I have, where they're building a lot of BRT systems, they're still relying on informal carriers to provide the feeder services. And in some cases, it's going to involve paying multiple fares for the paratransit connection and then the mainline trunk, whereas some of the informal carriers would provide, instead of trunk feeder services, just sort of a direct line connection from one part of the metropolitan area to the other, which sometimes works well when you have these informal settlements on the periphery just scattered all over the place. Sometimes a direct line, single vehicle service will probably perform a trunk feeder BRT paratransit network. So as it relates to affordability and travel time savings and so forth. So I think we have to be pretty careful when we look at options and what we do with this sector. If we eliminate it or marginalize it or embrace it or regulate it or incorporate it, what does it mean in terms of access and affordability for those sectors? And I think that's an area we just haven't done a good enough analysis to address quite seriously those core questions. Because I think virtually every project I'm familiar with, as it relates to major public transport investments in the developing world, the overarching goal is still one of trying to reduce poverty, extreme deprivation, and in some way improve the lot of very disadvantaged segments of society. So all the stuff we talked about yesterday and this morning, we need better evaluation metrics to look at these different options to see what fundamentally are the effects on access and affordability.
So my experience with paratransit is mainly in Africa and mainly in Tanzania. And I think I'm going to talk about it from a passenger perspective because one of the reasons it's a passenger perspective and it's an economic model perspective. As a passenger, paratransit doesn't give me a very good quality of service in terms of safety. You have to wait till the bus fills up, those type of things. Like there's a lack of reliability. There is definitely a greater geographic spread, you know, and there are a lot of pros to paratransit. But I think one of the things that we found is that as soon as you can afford to not take paratransit, you upgrade to the next best service. When I was working in Dar, I would take the Dala-Dalas, and the people I was working with in the city and the government it's not appropriate for their economic status. And the seats are rusty, and if you're wearing a nice suit, you don't necessarily want to get into something that doesn't seem clean or friendly or safe. So I think there's a status issue with paratransit that has to be addressed, because I think one of the things that we want to keep is people on transit. And paratransit, as it most typically rolls out, is not something that keeps people there. It's captive people, but it doesn't keep people who have choices to go to other types of systems. So if we're talking about paratransit, then we need to talk about a range of services that, as you maybe can afford, you can upgrade to a better class of service. And though I hate to say that, but this is what we're seeing. People won't use paratransit. So how do you create a transit system that keeps people on the buses, on the trains, whatever? That's the biggest concern with paratransit for me. Though I think it's also interesting, because I think what's happening in the US or with shared mobility is this idea of that there are other systems that need to be in place: ride share, car share, bike share, these things that are the intermediate systems. And we do need to have a more diversity of these type of systems. But going back to paratransit, the other thing that one of the things that we were really intrigued by with the Bogota model is this idea that you take the existing operators, you incorporate them into the new system, you bring them along with you. And it's this idea of economic growth, economic empowerment, this hope that you take entrepreneurial operators who have been providing a service that is much needed, and you bring them up with you with this new system. And it's a really intriguing model, and Bogota was successful in that transformation. It is really hard to do that in a city. We worked in Johannesburg on that, and that process was really complicated. I'm not sure it was a success. And in the capacity and business capacity that you need to bring to people who are informal operators is you need to really build up their capacity for it. And South Africa is really complicated with their taxi structure, so it's pretty intense. Not only is it complicated structurally, it also has a lot of territorial divides, and the violence is there too. So it was really intense, I think, for the people working on it. I wasn't so closely associated with it at the time, but so this idea is a really wonderful idea. And so in Dar, we've been looking at it too, like how do you bring the informal operators into the new system? And I mean, there's a lot of complicated decisions. How many companies? Do they own the buses? What's the financial model that's going to make sense, that makes private operations workable? Because paratransit, part of the reason why it is financially workable is the fact that they don't invest in capital. They ride their buses till they disintegrate. There are things that the drivers work all day. They don't have benefits. Like there's a different economic model, and paratransit works partly because it's not regulated. So when you move into a regulated environment, what is the financial model that works? And are the operators ready to take on that responsibility? And we're not sure. So I think in terms of paratransit, it is good in the spectrum, but I think from a passenger perspective, people may not necessarily agree with that. They want better quality of service, more reliability. They want to feel safe, clean, like reliable transit is there for them. If we want the middle class to keep using transit, we need to create better transit systems. If we're going to deal with the urban growth that's happening, we're going to need to be able to move more people more efficiently. Another thing with paratransit is it's not the most efficient of operations. You have the kind of constant competition, the penny wars it's called, and so if you're looking to make things a little bit more efficient so that you can move more people, you're going to need to move to a different system. So these are just some of the challenges with paratransit.
Juan Carlos?
I think that, as Bob was saying, it's really good to have a city with many different transportation alternatives. But on the side of the user, it's much better if those services fit into a single system. As if the user really receives or perceives a system that is really integrated in all its dimensions. And by integration, I mean not only fare, which I think is crucial, but also infrastructure, operations, and information. And I think that's a challenge that most cities should look for. And I think many do, but it's really hard to achieve. It's really hard to make a significant transformation in a city that will allow to have all these transport modes operating under the best circumstances possible for the system. And I think a very relevant question is how can you achieve that transformation that would eliminate in some way, for instance, the work for the penny that Aimée was saying. And I can see two different models in Latin America, and both of them has not been successful, I think. On one hand, we have Santiago, the city where I live, in which we decided to do the transformation almost in a single day. It was a big bang in Santiago, February 10, 2007, which went, for different reasons, went more abrupt than it was planned. I mean, we made the firms before, we brought the buses, but on a single day, we changed the payment system, we added the integration, and we changed the routes, aiming towards changing from a point-to-point into a trunk and feeder system. For many reasons that it's long to explain here, the change was very poorly received by the users because the supply was not where it was needed. It was really a major problem, so high that in Chile, the Transantiago is considered the worst public policy ever implemented in the country. It's not a joke. I don't see why you're laughing. It's drama, okay? Little by little, the system has been evolving into improving the service and making more reasonable for the service for the citizens. The transition was extremely traumatic, and the passengers in Santiago still resist the system because of its implementation. However, we are on the other side of the river now, where none of our Latin American cities are. We already have a fully integrated city where you can move between buses and between metro with a single fare, where now you can start working in implementing those elements that were missing during the transition, which is hard to forgive why we didn't do it. But still now we are on this other side of the river. On the other hand, we have Colombia or Brazil, which instead of following that path, they have decided, let's do it corridor by corridor. Let's do it little by little. And you know what? It's very hard to get to the other side. Why? Because incumbents decided, well, the next one is going to be me. Because in a city, you usually start by a corridor which probably you have the highest demand. So in Bogota, you start with Avenida Caracas, right? The biggest avenue in the city, where the cost of moving a passenger is the cheapest of the system. So by the end, you're living with everything that is the most costlier thing by the end, which makes really, it's like running a race where the last 10 meters are the ones that are going to be the most difficult. And what you see at the end is that these cities are really, really struggling to get the citywide integration system in place. So the question here is, which path should we follow? I will not advocate anyone to take the Santiago path because it was really, really traumatic and it almost tipped the government. However, if we think of Transantiago, maybe we should adapt it in some way. For instance, and this is what, if I could reverse time, this is what I would do in the case of Santiago. Now you had really the political decision of changing the system completely. I think it was silly to do all the things I mentioned at once. Instead, probably what you should do, and I think this is what I would advise a city if they ask me, is to keep all your services unchanged. Don't change the buses, don't change the frequencies, don't change anything, but implement fair integration at once, whole city. Once you do that, I mean, it would be a collapse anyway, but at least no one can complain that the system has changed for the worse as a user, because now what the system is giving me is more alternatives. Now, when before I had a single alternative, now I have a system. And of course, people will shift routes within the system in a way that somehow you can expect and you can be prepared to, but not with the level of detail that we were assuming in the case of Transantiago. So once you do it, you will have that, for instance, in the case of Bogotá, Transmilenio, which is the fastest mode in the city, will see its demand risen, as the Metro did in Santiago de Chile. And once you have that, you will see that there's a big misallocation of your supply considering how people want to travel. And then it will be very easy to change the buses and change the frequencies of the trains in order to adapt what people are doing. So I think that would be, that would be my intermediate path towards integration that could achieve the best of both worlds. You achieve citywide integration on a single day, which is the hardest thing to achieve, and then you move little by little to implement and adapt the frequency to each of the corridors.
That's very interesting. This is what you're suggesting is something that was done in Buenos Aires, in a country where there is a suburban railway, a subway, and a bus system, and they implemented a smart card for fair integration, and they installed the system in 17,000 buses. The train system's concession to 6 companies, and this is working now, and it was not traumatic at all, and it's worked. What I find is, and what you're saying is that, and it's my view, is that we've tried to move towards integration in one way or another, the Bogotá, South Africa model, Santiago model, and with these smart cards, which is not only in Buenos Aires, in many cities, trying to move away from this atomized systems where, despite the variety of the supply, you find the impacts of the externalities are so great that there has to be some way to order this. Now, just in this conversation, I find that there are different outlooks according to who the stakeholder is. Aimée mentioned the user. There's also the operator, and I think Elio mentioned yesterday the beneficiaries. And I think what I'll put to you is that these 3 actors or stakeholders have conflicting interests, and the difficulties are how you develop policies within these conflicting interests. Let me say one, maybe an informal system that, or let's get away from the informal point-to-point system as it existed in Santiago, existed in Bogotá before the reform, provides a service that is very beneficial to the user because high frequencies, point-to-point service, perhaps the buses aren't that bad, but if you look at the externalities, the congestion, the emissions, for the people that are not using the system, the impacts are very high. Now, how do we reconcile two stakeholders with completely different interests? What's your view on this? Oh, and I'll add the operator. Perhaps the operator, and this is perhaps why trunk feeder system exists, because they're highly efficient operation-wise and highly efficient in terms of emissions and externalities, but perhaps they don't provide the best service for a user who has to transfer, has to wait. How do we reconcile these three perhaps conflicting points of view, Juan Carlos?
Well, I think that the issues you're raising are some of the reasons why we definitely need public transport to be regulated. Public transport has become a crucial element for urban sustainability, and therefore it cannot just leave to whatever the operators want. And of course, at the same time, it needs to be affordable, and it needs to provide accessibility in the citywide, and therefore you need an agency that could coordinate and organize the system as a whole. And again, I would like to take this into what I mentioned before. I mean, cities desperately need a metropolitan authority, desperately. And too often you see, for instance, so I think that the conflict sometimes, it's not just between the passenger and the operator, because that could be regulated by the agency. But for instance, in my city, what I see is when people coming from the periphery go into the wealthiest neighborhoods, they get into a stop where there's no investment at all, because the local major realizes that the people that are taking the bus in that stop don't vote there. Don't vote there. So it's really hard. I mean, and I think those conflicts are really relevant. Or we've seen things like in my city which are amazing. Like one little neighborhood has its own public, like with the major, puts his own public bike system, and the neighbor one puts another one. So if you want to take your bike from one neighbor to another one, you cannot do it, because it's different systems. So I think the issue of coordination, metropolitan coordination, it's so relevant, and I think it needs to be taken to the highest level with countries. Like, this cannot be done this way. Another thing that I think it's relevant, and I think it's another type of design level conflict, is we all realize that public transport systems desperately need subsidies. I mean, not only because it's equitable, not only because it provides access and allow us for a better to avoid several of the externalities of the alternative modes, but also because it's efficient. Because the more people using public transport, the less people will wait, the less people will walk, even though among those that use it. So I think that's a very relevant issue. But my question that I want to raise is, what do you do with the money? And I think here there are two possible tracks. One is to say, okay, we need to give the minimum level of service that is reasonable at the minimum fare. So let's make it as affordable as possible, as cheap as possible. The other alternative, which has its merit, definitely, but it will not attract people from the cars moving to that public transport system. The other alternative is to say, well, we need one of the final goals here is to prevent people from moving from the cars or from the public transport to the cars, and therefore the issue is not about fares, it's more about quality of service. I think that's also another conflict. How do you allocate the funds into the system in order to achieve these goals? And one element that I think it's also quite relevant at the design level is that too often we design public transport system, and this is particularly true for buses, assuming that this will be the less costly alternative. And because it's the less costly alternative, we will do it as cheap as possible. And we end up designing systems that are designed to fit 6 passengers per square meters. In the most critical link, in the most crowded period, but still 6 passengers per square meter, which is an average of all buses, and which is an average of all spaces inside the bus. And that certainly, it's like shooting in our foot. Because in some way what we're saying is, this is not, if you have the alternative to have your car, to drive with air conditioning, to have your music, to be seated, why would you prefer to spend some of your trip, after all the inconveniences of public transport, in sharing your square meter with 12 other people. So I think this is very, and I think that when we choose for buses or BRT and realize that this is less costly than metro, for instance, we should realize that for it to be really an alternative, it has to have features that make it attractive and do things that metro can't. So I think that's also an issue on the design.
I agree. But when it comes to the issue of competing interests, I mean, I think this comes back to what we struggle with. It's the role of the government. The role of the government is so critical, and so often in the cities that we work in, that the capacity isn't there to do the things that need to happen. So when you were talking about, do you do a whole citywide change or do you do quarter by quarter? A lot of places that I've been working in, they don't have the capacity to do or to even think about a citywide change. So there has to. I think the level of capacity at the government is critical, and I think also just one thing on this is transit for me is kind of the fundamental precondition for talking about access. Access is based on transit availability and quality too. And I think if you're going to invest in access and invest in transit, you need to make sure that it is something that people will want to take, or not just something that they have to take. But what we're finding is, even after decades of work on this, both by ITDP and the larger transport community, we are woefully under-meeting our transit needs still. So another question that comes in is like, okay, we're having to deal with issues of metropolitan agencies and institutional issues, and the design guidance and the technical issues are important, but the political stuff is equally as important and much more complicated. Like, how do you set up a new institution and a government? How do you fund that institution? How do you deal with funding and financing of the transport systems? How do you deal with the mandate and the administrative authority for managing these systems? All of these things are really complicated, and if we're going to scale up to meet the needs that we have, it becomes even more critical. Like, how do we address these things, both from a money perspective, political will, and also from a capacity perspective?
I'll just a couple of brief remarks. So obviously externalities, we need to regulate it. So be it emissions or noise levels or fitness of vehicles or drivers, and obviously there's limited institutional capacity to monitor, enforce, and regulate. So again, we have to more essentially deal with building that capabilities to carry on those very important kind of policing oversight rules. But I think for the most part, there are places where we need to regulate supply, where you have kind of natural monopoly, declining marginal cost. You don't want over-competition. So a lot of BRT corridors, you could argue that we need to regulate supply. I don't think in the paratransit sector, in many cases, we need to be regulating vehicle size. I think, again, having a richer range of carrying capacity, speed levels, geographic coverage, given the evolution of cities, particularly in the developing world, is a very market responsive kind of supply side delivery. I think for the most part, we shouldn't be regulating prices. I think as long as, if it's not affordable, then that's a deeper issue in the sense that we can provide concessionary fares or some kind of user side subsidies to allow affordability in the transport sector. We should largely let the market define what the price levels are in the paratransit. My concern is that if we do over-regulate, we tend to get very standardized uniform services, kind of first world services. I mean, there's nothing wrong with someone in an 8-year-old vehicle with a tattered seat that's getting a 40% discount. I mean, we need to provide many more options in those choices. Just one point on design, on access. I agree, we need to design cities to promote and advance public transit, to make them accessible by good public transport. But we also need to make sure we have good access to public transit corridors. I've been looking at a lot of BRT systems where they're, for instance, piggybacking a lot of protected bikeways as part of them. But what you typically find is where they're getting the right-of-way for the BRT, they're running these parallel bicycle systems. So they're in certain ways sort of substitution modes. They're operating on very parallel corridors. What we need are more perpendicular kind of feeder connectors into these networks. And that's where, because there's not the funding to acquire the land or build the network as part of the BRT corridor, we sort of ignore that level of secondary access, be it footpaths or be it bikeways. So we tend to kind of focus on where we have big capital, what the enhancements are in these systems, but we're not very clever in terms of making sure access occurs at multiple levels, neighborhood scale access, regional access. So I think we need, again, to better enrich our metrics. So any BRT investment, my sense is it's not just the hardware of the channelways of the system, it's the entire armature of the network. You have to have secondary systems connecting to them. If you're going to do transit-oriented development, you've got to do the enhancements of the neighborhood. So we have to have investments and projects that allow that better definition of access as we design these systems.
Can be quick so that we can have the discussants.
I'll try my best. I'd like to pick up on Amy's point on capacity. I think that's a key thing to look at. But even more so within that capacity, it's not just government capacity, but it's really vested interests, understanding vested interests. I don't think we'll get anywhere if vested interests aren't understood. And it's on the part of government, it's on the part of operators, and on the part of anybody involved. The problem with that is it's very difficult to understand what they are before a change. It's really in hindsight, Juan Carlos, your point about what you would do differently. I think these public transport investments are enormously costly, but they allow the kind of the rug to be shaken to see who pops out as being the key players. And I think it is often in retrospect that we learn where these capacities lie, and whether it's a phased approach, a whole city approach, significant efforts, I think, must be put to understanding vested interests and then understanding incentives that will get those vested interests to move. A fundamental thing I think that we're scared of doing is admitting defeat. We must always look towards positive things where we've learned what we've achieved, the newest, the best, the greatest. And perhaps it's, for us who are academics, it's an unwillingness to the system that we're within to have a null finding, to say that, okay, well, we actually haven't learned anything, or we've gone backwards. We're not really encouraged to do that, to say, okay, well, we haven't done anything here. And my appeal to try and move forward is actually for all of us to admit defeat and document it. I think the Santiago case, you have done a fair bit actually to document the process where it's been difficult. But in all of these cases, I mean, your experience is extensive. I think there's a huge, huge opportunity here for us to move forward by understanding what doesn't work and to take the perspective of vested interests in doing that and doing that reporting.
Okay, thanks. So now we have 4 discussants. Mr. David King, Assistant Professor of Urban Planning, Columbia University. The idea is perhaps that you make a comment on what you've heard and a question to the panelists, please.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the discussion. I do my work primarily in New York City in the United States, but I also do a fair amount of work in China and on transit finance. And one of the driving questions that I'm looking at in my work is what are the complementary modes that we should be focusing on, the complementary transportation modes that can help us make the most of our investment in fixed route transit and how to pay for things. And I'm very encouraged by this discussion of the multiplicity of choice that is needed for a truly accessible city. And this is something that's really important. One of my current projects, I'm developing a taxonomy of transit in New York City. And New York City is a very transit-oriented city, the most transit-oriented city in the United States. I've identified 32 separate categories of transit provision. This is a lot. This is far more than we generally think about in terms of, well, we're going to build trains, we're going to build buses, whatever it might be. We also have informal transit here. We have multiple forms of taxis. We have commuter shuttles. Just on my way here this morning, because these are the types of things I do, I stood on the corner of 43rd and 5th, and I watched all the private apartment shuttles stop at the bus stop. And I watched probably 6 or 7 of these private apartment shuttles stop at a bus stop, and there's 2 or 3 additional private transit operators that use this bus stop. I did not see a public transit bus use the bus stop. So this brings up an issue when we're thinking about this multiplicity of choice. How do we think about access to the street space? And where are these systems being placed? Who gets access to the curb? Who has the monopoly on access to the curb? These are all really, really important issues that as planners we're not spending nearly enough time thinking about. And it's all part of access. If we're going to have all these different types of services, we have to think about how do we put them in their place along the streets. And this idea of that we have to connect the BRT corridors, not just with all these parallel operations, but actually connecting them and creating nodes. As planners, it's very difficult for us with foresight to predict all the ways to connect these nodes. And how can we be flexible in our politics? How can we be flexible in our finance to allow this flourishing? And the challenge of trying to formalize informal transit is really, really important. And and in some ways, informal transit works, and this was brought up, but it works precisely because it's informal. And so then we have to do analyses. Are the costs associated with that informality in terms of labor and comfort and these other factors, do the benefits of that informality outweigh the costs? And is the informal a stepping stone toward a more formal progression? In New York, we see a lot of informal transit as a stepping stone towards more integration into the formal economy. So there's a lot of things here, and I think this is a wonderful panel for thinking about that. So for the panelists, I guess the question that I would throw out would be building on my own experience in New York of looking at allocating street space, but how do you allocate the space to accommodate all of these different types of transit where you may not have the same type of governance structure and engineering support that we do in the United States?
Just 1 minute or a couple of
I
minutes.
think here probably there are some conflicts that need to be highlighted. The main conflict is the car. I mean, the car needs to be addressed, and we need to understand that during the peak periods in those places where everybody wants to be, there's no room for really a lot of people using the car, and therefore the conflict needs to be how to address the car. Once you've addressed the car, for instance, taking them out from a certain area, all this conflict disappears. Still, I think, and I still think that we need to, for instance, in the case of BRT, which is what we do in our center, to develop some good strategies to make the BRT more compatible, for instance, with pedestrians and cyclists. But there are places in the world where this has been done quite successfully, where you can have areas where buses running slowly, pedestrians and cyclists can coexist in different downtown sectors. Another thing that I would do is that, for instance, for BRT, is that sometimes we build these huge corridors, amazing, but when they are about to reach downtown, the city gets a little bit more compact and there's no room for the corridor, and we stop them. And this would be like running a train that instead of leaving you coming from Boston to here, but instead of getting to downtown, it leaves you like, 2 or 3 kilometers away from where you want to go, and then you have to walk or whatever. This is what happened in Santiago, and I'm not kidding. And so with buses. So I think that we should also, in the case of buses, lose the fear of eventually, in some places, maybe you can also have buses going underground. For instance, if you really want to provide fast speed through downtown where there's no room, well, maybe for 1 or 2 kilometers you can do that. And I think that these are the 2 main challenges of the mode.
I just want to agree that I think the car is the biggest issue when it comes to dealing with street space, and I think everything else can be sorted out.
Yeah, I was going to, in developing countries, I think the biggest problems are at these major terminal transfer points where it's not only private minibuses and public formal buses, but it's street hawkers and street vendors and all the markets and all that. So I think for the most part, we have to be very careful in designing and engineering for logistics and interchange and those functions from kind of place functions. And in certain ways, it's just engineering and staging areas or platform areas. And it may be even resiting some of the market areas, but having, the reality is there needs to be some connection because those informal vendors are relying on the informal transit users to sell their goods and wares. So design, I think it's just good design, but fundamentally separating logistical, utilitarian kind of activities from kind of place functions.
I think another misconception or conception that we should challenge is that congestion is bad. I think it's an enormously powerful tool, and it's not a person that makes a decision, so you can't point fingers. It's everybody, and everybody is culpable who contributes to that situation. And once you reach that point, then you can make these decisions. Then it allows policymakers, decision makers, a lot of flexibility in what to do. And it's a wonderful opportunity.
Okay. Deborah, Salon, from Assistant Professor, School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, Arizona State University.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be here. This panel's been very interesting. A little different than I expected, I guess, with the title of the panel was How to Best Design and Implement Better Access in Cities. And I found myself sitting there listening to the various things that people said, which I almost completely agree with and really appreciate. But being a little surprised that the focus was almost exclusively on transit. Because when I think, I've done some projects related to transit in my research, but the way I think about access is really a multimodal approach, and I think you all do too, just the conversation went in this particular direction today. So I wanted to bring us back to thinking about land use and multimodal access, because when I think about how to design and implement access in cities, I think about I think more about distances and times. How far do we have to travel? How can we reduce that in terms of either distance or time or both in order to get to the things we need every day? And I didn't hear much discussion about that. And so I guess I'll share a brief story about that and then ask the panel to talk about it a bit. I've recently, in my own research, been thinking a lot about how can you design places to reduce the amount that people have to travel, whether it's by transit or bike or walk or by car. And I've been doing this along with a few of my colleagues, and we've had a lot of trouble coming up with the answer to this question. And actually, I've had a conversation with Andres and a few others last night about it. And one of the answer comes out being this very, very unsatisfying, well, it depends, right? If you and so then the policymaker comes up and says, well, but if I want to really design a place that has great access for the people who are going to live and work there, what do I do? He said, well, it depends. And they say, well, it depends. Okay, well, what does it depend on? Well, it's really hard to say without going there and doing a big planning process with that particular community in that particular place. So it's very hard to give generalizable advice, is what myself and my colleagues have arrived at after doing a lot of data analysis. So it's sort of an embarrassing result. Anyhow, but I thought I would ask the panel if you had any thoughts on that question and maybe bring in transit again, but sort of also just thinking more generally about how do you design a place that has good access. And I guess one more point of background I'll bring is that in the conversation last night, it was pointed out, and I think this is really true, that in a lot of parts of the world, especially in the developing world, people are coming to cities. A lot of people are coming to cities. We are building new places. And so this question is relevant. We're not only thinking about retrofitting existing places. In a lot of parts of the world, there are new cities being built, new suburbs being built, new urban areas being built at a rapid rate. And so this question of how do we make them accessible places, new places, accessible places, is a really, really important one, I think. So,
okay. I'll answer, it depends.
I have two reactions to this topic. One would be that to be a transit user, you are always a pedestrian at some point. And I think that too often this is forgotten, and authorities are much more sensitive to potholes in the streets than to sidewalks that are not even or not even built. And I think that this is an issue that, especially in the developing world, we should be concerned. Like how we do in our pyramid of priorities, how do we actually give priority to pedestrian movement, which is not only important for people that will be walking to local activities, but also to taking the public transport. So access for me, like the first thing I would do is to move in that direction. My second thought, which is totally different, is if you realize that, for instance, in the case of Santiago, which is a 6 million inhabitant city, we have like 5 million of trips every day in public transport. That makes public transport the most important place in the city, the most important place where people meet. And you have to think also that in this integrated system that I was talking before, people tend to concentrate on some particular station or some particular stops. So a very relevant question is, how do we make those places not just functional, but fun? Where people can have commercial activities and buy stuff and get services, or make them the most amazing museums in the city. Because if people will really go, and I think museums are places where not many people go. However, the most important interchange of 2 metro lines in the city probably receives 1 million visits every day. So why don't we make those places really the most important museum in the city, as some stations have done, by the way. But I think that it should be more intentional. I think here there's an opportunity to make public transport not just a functional system in which people, that moves people, but allowing them to get many other needs fulfilled, especially those that are collective.
I've said that transit is kind of the precondition for when I think about accessibility, accessibility. But I think the second thing that is equally as important is this kind of, I was just reading this thing by Mary Rowe from Municipal Arts Society about connective tissue. So the way that the transit integrates with the neighborhood and connects to it. And I think walking is the kind of a fundamental premise for that connective tissue. But I think when we talk about accessibility, we need to kind of talk about communities and internal accessibility and mixing of uses and services and of incomes. And so it's partly the land use and the urban development piece. It's part having mobility choices. It's grounded on a walking environment that's activated and safe and high quality. So you're not running into a pothole in a sidewalk. I guess they would be called potholes. And or an obstruction, or you have to walk into the street because there's not a sidewalk. But all of that needs to be connected to the transit infrastructure too, in a way that creates these really high quality, accessible places, both internally and externally to the rest of the city.
So I'll just make a remark more on the land use side. You know, all things equal, people want to be accessible. They want to be close to jobs and education opportunities and play and learn and so forth. And employers want to be near potential workers and their customers. So the market should be bringing about better access. I think we all, so, you know, there's this kind of co-location theory that the market should allow co-location of all these multiplicity of activities. But we all know there's barriers to that, and quite a bit of them are based on exclusion and discrimination. And so we have this entire sort of apparatus of land use management based on zoning, and zoning has largely been used to, you know, the original idea was not to have people living near smokestacks or slaughterhouses, but in sort of a clean industry service economy era, that logic doesn't work anymore. So we're seeing it more based on class and other kind of factors, race and so forth. So anything that we can do to break down those barriers, you know, enforce fair housing laws and anti-discrimination laws, or promote inclusion. Inclusionary zoning is obviously a very important step forward. You know, I think one of the things we can obviously do is just through our planning tools is that when we evaluate projects, not only look at the effects on level of service, you know, a subdivision or a major employment center on the surrounding interchanges, but what is that going to do to enhance access? So So if someone's building housing, is it affordable to the workers nearby? So we do have these kind of assessments of projects as we make these marginal land use decisions. How is it contributing to better access? Or, there's a finite limited supply of real estate with great access, and the market bids it up. So we talked a lot about value capture ideas, but that money in theory should be going to provide affordable housing near TOD or things like that. I mean, we hear that's a complaint of a lot of good contemporary land use strategies that's only affordable to the wealthy. And if we want to have mixed income inclusionary development, we need to be smart in how we do things like that to provide better access. So I think we have a lot of theories and tools to allow this, and for the most part, I think the market does work towards access. We just have to break down the barriers and flip our thinking about land use regulation and management from kind of zoning and separation more towards inclusion and working with the tools available to do that. So.
In talking about access, distance is unavoidable. And I think what we see with influxes in developing world city is that people locate at the periphery because of these forces of the market and many other reasons, perhaps even ignorance about these forces. And at some point, motorization enters into the argument because people need to overcome distance to access places of employment. Naturally we will turn to public transport, and because all of us are from that fraternity as well, but it's also about limited capacity and what the collective good needs and what would serve the collective good better. And I think that is why traditionally we have systems that are geared towards providing motorized access. There is no universal answer again, but I think if you were a city government, it's easier to think about what would serve the collective good than setting up systems that could provide better sidewalks at each person's house. It's not a satisfactory answer, but that seems to be to fit into the tradition that we have in many of our cities.
Okay, thanks. Next discussant, Dorothy McCormick, the African Center of Excellence for Studies in Public and Non-motorized Transport. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have been listening with great interest and trying to draw out of the many really interesting ideas that are being presented some themes that either I hear or were in my head and I don't hear. I was struck at the beginning with Herrie's comment about people know what they need. And I think that's true, but we don't often ask them. And so we may not know what they know that they need. And I think that that points to issues of methodology. Some of us are researchers. I am one. I'm at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Nairobi, and we've been part of this asset program. And what I have been hearing is that to some extent, some cities, some places have data, others don't. The city I am in doesn't have very much. And the data that is usually there, if it is there, is survey data of some sort or another, either gotten through interviews or through observation it's of a quantitative nature. But that doesn't always capture what people know that they need because of the way questions are structured. If you're dealing with structured questionnaires, often it comes out of what you know or don't know, rather than, and may skip over things that people know. So I think an issue of methodology is one that we all need to give a bit more thought to. And the things that we've been doing most recently in Nairobi dealt with case studies, where we took a small number, but we asked more in-depth questions so that we would get to understand how people are thinking. I also heard in the panel the point, which I think is very important and valid, understanding what doesn't work. analyzing what we have tried and where that might be going. A second big theme that I've been hearing about is informality. But I don't hear us saying what that means. And there have been whole books written on what is informality. What one might call the informal matatu paratransit system in Nairobi is called informal, but it is heavily regulated. There are chapters in the Traffic Act. There are regulations coming out every other day that say matatu operators must do this. They may not do that. They must have this piece of equipment. So if informality is equal to unregulated, we have an issue here that we have to deal with. So what is informality? What are we talking about when we say paratransit is informal? A third issue that's emerging that I think is important is quality of service. And that's related, I believe, to the affordability question and to the inequality question. And I think there's a big divide, and dichotomies are never completely helpful, but they can be a starting point. We have those for whom the alternative to paratransit is buying a car. And whether they have it now or they look forward to having it, buying a car is their alternative. In Nairobi, we have a very large proportion of the population, probably close to half, for whom the alternative to paratransit is walking because they can't afford paratransit. And so the priorities of those two groups of people can be quite different. The priority for a low fare in one group, the priority of safety, time, distance, convenience in a different group. And that brings me to what I think is the fifth theme, which is different, and that's financing. Earlier, someone mentioned that with paratransit, often what happens is the vehicle gets run into the ground until it won't run anymore. But in some places, and fortunately this is where Nairobi, I think, has something to offer, there are other financing mechanisms. The government of the Transport Ministry noticed some few years ago that there were some paratransit vehicles, particularly the ones that ran intercity services rather than the city bus services, who had joined together in cooperatives, in savings and credit cooperative organizations. And the government thought that this was something that could be used and tapped as operational management mechanisms. And so in 2010, and also, of course, we had a very atomized system, one owner with one matatu or two or three, but there was one count of matatus done at the end of 2012, and in the city of Nairobi, there are 10,000 of them. And so it was a nightmare for government to try to even license those 10,000 vehicles. So government decided, in its wisdom, which has turned out to actually have some wisdom to it, to force them to join together in some way. And so they were required to join either as companies, sort of franchise-type operations, or companies that owned vehicles, or into these savings and credit organizations. And what we have learned in a very small research project that we've been doing as part of the asset program is that the financing aspect of savings and credit organizations is very important, because the owners don't have to run their vehicle into the ground, because as a requirement for membership, they must save daily. So they're putting money aside, and that entitles them either to withdraw some of that money if they have a big repair job, for example, or because the SACOs, we call them, are linked to the cooperative movement in the country and therefore also linked to the cooperative bank, they can borrow at a reasonable rate to replace their vehicles. And this has turned out to be quite important because, of course, all of these owners are private sector individuals. They want a return on their investment. They want to make a profit. And if they can manage their repairs and maintenance and replacements more easily, they will be more profitable. And so it appears to be quite a good system as far as we have seen it. Now, we've seen it through 10 case studies of intercity vehicles. And the SACO sizes are quite wide-ranging, from one that barely meets the minimum, which is 30 vehicles, to one that has over 500. From some that are a couple of years old that were brought in when the requirement was made, to some that go back to the 1990s, the early 1990s. So we have a variety, but it's the intercity ones whose operating is different from the city transit. So we're hoping that maybe we can study those city ones as well and see if they live up to the same good behavior. Because they are beginning to use them as management tools as well as financing mechanisms, with the SACO taking on some of the monitoring that is needed. So my question for the panel is really on the last point. Are there any cooperatives or companies or other kinds of organizing mechanisms that you're aware of? And is financing an important issue in your particular context? The financing of repairs, of replacements, of operations. Thank you.
Yeah. So the next discussant, we'll have the next discussant and deal with the questions together, right? Yes. Please. Yes, so it's Andrea Rizvi, Center for Sustainable Urban Development. Thank you.
Good morning. So let me start by just saying thank you to the panel. I really enjoyed the discussion today. I'm not going to, because Deborah, David, and Dorothy did such a great job of summarizing and critiquing the discussion, I'm going to cut to the chase. I know I stand in the way of you and coffee, and just ask my question. So really my question is this. When we talk about topics such as how to design and implement better access in cities, we so often get caught up in a discussion about what we're going to do. And we heard some and these are important issues, what we do. I think sometimes in the debate we get lost and forget to ask the how question. Today I was really relieved to hear a little bit, quite a bit of discussion about the how in terms of the strategies and the tactics we might think about when we implement these schemes. In Santiago, the big bang approach versus in Colombia, where they've adopted a more incremental approach. It frustrates me sometimes that perhaps as researchers we don't try and capture that knowledge enough. And then another dimension that gets missed beyond the how is the when. And we all know that timing does matter. So I guess my question to the panel is, how do you think as researchers and practitioners we can do a better job of capturing some of both our successes and failures in the when question, both in terms of the moment in which we act and the length, the duration of our action? How do we do a better job of learning from our experience and intervening at the right moment?
Okay, so we have how much? 5 minutes? Okay. I'm going to get fired because we went over time. Yeah. So you have 2 questions? the financing question and the when question.
No, the question is very simple, to be honest. The question of how to coordinate in the systems that I'm looking, once, for instance, in Santiago, once you have shifted towards having some firms, the firms are already quite big, so the cooperation is inside the firm of the buses. And what is interesting, though, is that the firms that are operating in Santiago, which are 7, they have decided to coordinate also in a broader organization called Actus very recently, after 6 years after Santiago started, really, in order to collaborate in some of the elements you mentioned. I'm not sure if they will be sharing some financial opportunities, but certainly good practices, and also providing a common face with the agency. And I think it has proven pretty useful. I would like to see the same on the side of the users. If users could also coordinate and have a common organization, would be really fantastic. And the second question is even more difficult. I mean, I think that we're all trying to address and show what's going on and publish it. There's a lot of opportunities and a lot of discussion on interest on knowing what's going on. So I know how I'm going to answer. So next year, I'm organizing a conference in Santiago de Chile called THREAD. It's going to be the first week of September. This is a fantastic conference in which we gather people from academia, from operators, from agencies, and from executives from different consulting groups. It's a very unique opportunity in which the discussion is organized in 8 different workshops. That's exactly how I met Andrea. And in each of these workshops, people from different areas can discuss into a particular question for 2 days. And by the end, we end up publishing all these experiences into a journal or into some documents. So I think that Threadboy is also an amazing opportunity. It's going to be next year. I'm going to be distributing a leaflet maybe, or a little paper showing, giving the information. Santiago de Chile, first week of September, you're all very welcome. And the call for papers is due by the end of the year. Cool.
So from a financing perspective, I think South Africa has experience with cooperatives, but I don't know so much. I think the biggest challenge that I've heard from operators when it comes to financing is getting banks to trust them and informal operators tend to be a higher risk, so maybe forming cooperatives alleviates some of that risk, but I think that's the biggest challenge from an operator perspective. But I do want to call out that financing for infrastructure is also equally as important and is something that we should be talking about as well. It may be that we can leverage more transit with better financing than we are able to do right now with our current present-day dollars. Going to Andrea's question about the how is really, for me, the most interesting. It's the intersection of the technical and the political. And the technical people get, like, okay, I need to do this many meters, da-da-da-da. But what we hear from governments time and time again is, like, but how did you take that decision? Or how did this happen? And so one of the things that I get the most excited about from a research perspective, actually, is this idea of how did the decisions get made? How do governments think about these things? How do they balance these kind of competing needs between different stakeholders and even government goals, whether it's environmental or social? And with TOD, one of the things that we've been looking at is kind of saying, okay, these are best practices of TOD. How did these things happen? To kind of give guidance to other governments about, why did you decide that particular regulation? How did you decide that the zone should be this big? Just because I think people don't, I think that's really interesting and helpful, so.
Very briefly, on the finance, I guess, I agree, cooperatives can really do a good job of representing a broader set of interests. And I know looking at cooperatives in Mexico City and a few other areas, they've done good jobs of getting deals on insurance and fuel and parts and supplies so they can represent the broader interests. But many times they turn into cartels, and there's issues there in terms of their ability to integrate because they represent this sort of oligopolistic kind of interest. To me, I think if you look again at the infusion of major capital going in the urban transport sectors globally, it is largely big-scale bus rapid transit, rail projects, these kinds of things. So I think those that are providing the aid, lenders, need to in some way attach to their loans some mechanism to ensure better coordination, to deal with the displacement effects of microbus either leaving the industry or relocating to some other part of the country or becoming co-shareholders or operators. But I think those that wield the biggest clout, that have the money in some way, need to tie their lending portfolios and packages to some coherent plan to allow better integration. On the sort of when and how, I think many of us in the field of transportation, even what we've talked about access, we tend to do very quantitative analyses and regressions, and that tells you kind of what and perhaps why, but it doesn't tell you how. So obviously, I think we have to depend much more on qualitative case studies. Aspirational, good case studies. For the most part, those that politicians don't relate to variables in quantitative analysis. They'll understand good stories and anecdotes, and there's always a risk to distort that for political purposes. But that aside, I think we have to package our case studies. I mean, we have a tendency in our fields to write these very voluminous kind of 50-page cases, and we really are talking about the 30-second elevator conversation with the CEO or the politician, and how do we hit those key messages. So I like to think, I challenge my students to write vignettes, kind of 3 to 5 page summaries to really hit those cases. So we can write for the academic community the 50-page volumes that 30 people worldwide might read, but I think in terms of really hitting the people that matter, that make these tough choices, we've got to write aspirational cases. And I think we have to train writing skills, communication skills much more effectively as part of public policy programs, planning programs, and so forth.
First, to respond to Dorothy's point, there are some of these small cases where there are, for instance, recapitalization schemes, like in South Africa and Mexico City, that don't have the appeal of large projects that are part of the international movements that we might see. And I couldn't agree more with your point, Bob, on writing vignettes, at the very least, about the smaller experiences that in the case of South Africa has achieved quite a measure of success. A lot of small operators buy into these schemes. I think the word incentive is the key thing here, is what are the right incentives that cause that to happen? And that's a kind of a difficult thing without being ingrained in a particular situation. So there's a challenge to all of us who have knowledge of it to at least write vignettes or to actually focus on writing accessible language short pieces. On the question of when the stars align. In South Africa, the stars aligned. If they didn't around this major 2010 event, I doubt anything would have happened. We wouldn't have seen change. In other cases, a pragmatic leader. We see mayors, we see political figures. In the case of some cities, we even see operators, powerful operators bringing about change. They're not predictable, and it's difficult to join a bandwagon if you don't know it's coming. But I think sometimes a lot of these things are out of our control, and it just happens to be at the right place at the right time. It's a very unsatisfactory answer, but unfortunately the world works in the way it works, and often we're powerless against these forces.
Okay. Finished? Thank you very much. Thank you the panelists and the discussants. Sorry we went overboard, but these people talk too much, basically. A lot to say. Thank you.